It's 6:30, so I think we'll make a start. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to Bridge Clinic London. And thank you very much for your attendance this evening. My name is James Barr. I am the Managing Director of the clinic, and we are a relatively new fertility clinic based in central London. We're very passionate about being able to offer affordable, accessible, and yet compassionate care to all our patients, and that's our mission for the future. We're very excited that this is our first webinar this evening, and I'm delighted to introduce Marta Jansa Perez to you, who's our Director of Embryology. And she will be demystifying the myths surrounding IVF in a few moments. But before we start, I think just a couple of housekeeping issues. This webinar is being recorded, and we will be uploading this event onto our website after tonight's meeting. So you'll be able to catch anything that you missed by going onto our website. Also, we have enabled the chat facility in this meeting. Marta will be pausing at various points during her presentation to answer any questions that you may have. There will also be an opportunity at the end of the presentation to ask any further questions. Our plan is to take about 45 minutes. We may finish a little bit sooner, but let's see what happens. But without further ado, I will now hand you over to Marta to start the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Thank you. I'm going to try and share my slides now. See them now?
Yes. Yeah, they're on screen, Marta.
Lovely, thank you. Hold on, let me put the first slide. So thank you, thanks for the lovely introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I am really delighted to be here and to be able to share with everyone our experience in providing IVF and how we think that providing evidence-based and patient-centered care really can give patients the best chance of success and best chances of pregnancy. I am, as James said, the Director of Embryology here. I have 25 years experience in human embryology, and I am a clinical scientist with a background in molecular genetics. I am very passionate about the care that we provide. And as all together as a team, we very much believe that patients need to have as much information as possible to be able to make decisions throughout the course of treatment. And we try and empower everyone to understand the process as much as they want or they can. And we'll go through the IVF process today with the aim of demystifying some of the things that are being discussed in IVF and making sure that I highlight what is important in IVF in order to maximize the chances of success. So this next slide is just about our website and about our service. James already explained that we are located very conveniently between Euston and King's Cross, but also we are accessible in many other ways in that we communicate with patients very actively and we make sure that we answer all the questions they might have at any point in treatment. So I will start by discussing who is it that needs IVF. As some people might know, IVF was invented to treat mostly women who had their fallopian tubes blocked. And for this group of patients, there's no other way to get pregnant than to do IVF, because obviously if the tubes are damaged or blocked, the sperm and the eggs can't meet and fertilization cannot happen naturally. And I'll explain a bit more about how it works naturally in a minute. We are treating more and more people that fall within the category of unexplained infertility. And this is about 30% of the patients we treat now. And this is heterosexual couples that have tried to conceive for at least 1, if not 2 years, and they're not managing to get pregnant. And for those people, often we can never find out what it is that is preventing them from getting pregnant. But by doing IVF, we can bypass whatever the problem is and give them a real chance of pregnancy. We also treat with IVF people who have tried other sorts of treatments, and that is, for example, intrauterine insemination or ovulation induction. Intrauterine insemination we do sometimes with either partner sperm, if it's a heterosexual couple, or with donor sperm, and this can apply to same-sex female couples, single women, or heterosexual couples where the man does not produce any sperm. And this is a treatment that can be successful, although the success rates are slightly lower than they would be with IVF. And this is why we usually recommend to do a few cycles. And if it doesn't work, then we would recommend to move on to IVF, which, for the reasons that I will explain, provides patients with a higher chance of ending up with a live birth. And we also now, well, we've treated them for many years, men who have very low sperm counts, a very poor sperm quality. We will do what we call ICSI, which is a variation of IVF, whereby we inject the sperm into the eggs after egg collection. And I'll explain a bit more in detail the technicalities of it all, in the hope that that will help people in the audience understand what it all means when they embark in an IVF or ICSI cycle. So I thought I would start by explaining the basic principles of how it happens naturally. So people who manage to get pregnant naturally do so by the fact that every woman, if they ovulate, every month they will release an egg from the ovary, and that's caught by the fallopian tube. And that egg in the fallopian tube starts traveling down and is met in there by the sperm. So if we're talking about a heterosexual couple, at the point where the sperm is released into the vagina, it will travel through the cervical canal all the way up through the uterus and into the fallopian tube, and it is there where it meets the egg. And if we're lucky, one sperm will enter the egg and will fertilize, and the embryo will start developing as it travels down the fallopian tube. And it travels down for 5 days, which is a surprisingly long time, and it reaches the uterus on that 5th or 6th day at the stage which is called blastocyst stage. And this is a stage of embryo development when the embryo is ready to implant, and it implants in the endometrial cavity there, as you can see in that picture. So as you can see, the process of fertilization and embryo implantation is quite complex, and it has lots of steps that we can't see. And sometimes there might be one of the steps that doesn't work. And for those people that have unexplained infertility, we will never find out. But by doing IVF, we will bypass any of those difficulties. So in essence, when we do IVF, what we're trying to do is mimic what the fallopian tube does. We will collect the eggs from the ovary before they ovulate, and we will fertilize them in the lab, and we will grow the embryos in the lab until the point where they're ready to go into the uterus. And at that point, we will insert them into the uterine cavity. So very much of what we try to do with the high technical tools and equipment and processes that we have, mostly in the lab, is mimic the conditions that the eggs and the embryos would be in the fallopian tube, with the aim of creating embryos that will give patients the best chance of getting pregnant. So I wanted to show with this slide a lot of the equipment that we use and the steps that we undertake for treatment. And I was just wanting to highlight that as professionals often talk to patients with a lot of jargon and technical terms. And I think what I want to try to do today is try and make sure that people don't get worried about those terms, that people understand as much as possible, and that they feel empowered and able to ask any questions either before the treatment, throughout the treatment, because we very firmly believe here at Bridge Clinic that providing information is giving patients the best sort of support they can have. Of course, we provide them with emotional support throughout the treatment, and that includes our counseling service, but we also provide ongoing support in the sense that we will give information and answer questions as much as we can throughout the treatment. So I'm gonna start explaining how we get the eggs and the sperm into the lab, and I'll pause after that in case there are any questions at that point. So in terms of the eggs, as I've said before, we usually women ovulate one egg every month. What we try to do with IVF is we stimulate the ovaries so that the woman produces more than one egg. And the idea with that is that we can create more than one embryo and be able to choose the embryo or embryos that will give patients the best chance of pregnancy. So we will tailor the stimulation regime so that we get a reasonable number of eggs. We're usually aiming to get between 10 and 15 eggs. And that again very much depends on the ovarian reserve of the woman that's being stimulated. I'm showing in this slide a folliculogram, which is a graph that we use to plot the follicles in the ovaries. And we will trigger ovulation at the point where there are at least 3 follicles above that line that you can see in the graph, which is 18 millimeters. And that is the point when we think the eggs that are growing in the follicles in the ovary are ready for the trigger injection, which essentially mimics what the hormone that triggers ovulation naturally, which is called luteinizing hormone. The injection we give for triggering ovulation mimics what that hormone does, and what it does is it triggers the eggs to become mature. And what we do is, instead of waiting for the eggs to be completely mature and ovulate, we go into the ovaries and collect those eggs before they get into the fallopian tube. And this image here shows you an ultrasound probe attached with a needle, and that's the needle we use to aspirate the fluid in the follicles. And that fluid is passed to us embryologists in the lab by the clinician, and under the microscope we will look for eggs. The eggs look like that picture you can see there. They're surrounded by a huge group of cells, the cumulus cells that nourishes them and protects them. And those eggs that we collect, we will put them in culture straight at the point of egg collection and put them in an incubator that mimics the conditions that they would be in the body. And they will be waiting until the afternoon when we'll put them together with the sperm. So of course we need to get the sperm into the lab. And this is a slide that contains a video that hopefully will show you how sperm look like under the microscope. Sperm, oh, sorry for the music. Hold on, there you go. So sperm are very small cells compared to the egg, which is the biggest cell in the body, but they have the ability to swim, as most people might know. And what we do when we prepare the sperm in the lab is we select the sperm in the sample that are motile and normal in shape, so that we end up with a sperm preparation in culture media that is very rich in good normal sperm. Every man produces in their ejaculate sperm that are not normal or that are not moving. That's absolutely within the normality. And what we try and do is prepare the sperm that have the highest chances of fertilizing an egg. I've put here a photo, a drawing of the reproductive system of a male, so that people know that even though most of the time we use sperm from the ejaculate, sometimes we need to retrieve it from the testes or from the epididymis. This is for men that don't have sperm in the ejaculate. Some men, for example, with cystic fibrosis have the epididymis blocked, and we need to retrieve the sperm from there. And for some men, we have to take it from the testes with what's called a testicular biopsy. Some men, for example, with spinal cord injuries, will have what's called retrograde ejaculation, and this is when the sperm goes into the bladder instead of coming out in the ejaculate. And again, we can get the sperm out of the urine for those men. And sometimes we use ejaculated sperm that has been frozen, and that's the case for all of the sperm that is used when it's donated. This sperm needs to be frozen so that we can quarantine and maximize the safety of that sperm for the recipients of sperm. So we always use frozen sperm when it's donated, but also sometimes we freeze sperm in heterosexual couples when the man is not going to be in the same place when we do the egg collection or when men think that they might have some difficulty producing a sample on the day of treatment. So I'm going to pause here and try and change to the next slide. Yes, in case there are any questions now that people have asked and might be interested in me responding at this stage.
There's nothing so far, Marta, so I think I would just carry on with your presentation. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you. I'll pause again at some other points, but otherwise we can discuss things at the end. And if no one has questions or comments at the end, we're very happy to be called or emailed at any stage to answer anything. So once we have the eggs and the sperm in the lab, what we do is we have to put them together by either standard IVF insemination, and this is when we place a lot of motile sperm together with the eggs in culture. And the idea is that eggs will fertilize in vitro as they would do naturally by the sperm, one sperm entering the egg, as it would happen naturally in the fallopian tube. And for those people that we have no concerns about the sperm being able to do that, we mix 150,000 sperm with group of 3 or 4 eggs, and we hope that fertilization will happen like this. For people that we need to inject the sperm into the egg, and this is people whose sperm parameters are below the normal range or who've had IVF before with very low or no fertilization, we will inject the sperm into each mature egg. And that's about 50% of the patients we treat. So it's not that rare, it's not unusual, and it's very much a routine technique. And this is another little video that shows you how ICSI works. Again, it's for people to understand what we do in the lab. You can see a sperm here swimming. We will slice the tail of the sperm so that it stops moving. This is an injection pipette. So we will break the tail, and what it does is it stops it moving, but it also breaks the membrane of the sperm, and it facilitates fertilization when we put the sperm into the egg. So we catch it with the injection needle and we take it right to the drop where we have the eggs. These is eggs that have been stripped, so we remove all of the cells around them, so they no longer look like they looked at egg collection. But these are the eggs that are mature that we will inject. And you can see this egg is a big cell that has another little cell at about 6 o'clock. This is what we call the first porous body, and it shows us that the egg is mature. So we will hold the egg with the holding pipette. This is all done by micromanipulation in the lab. And whilst the egg is held, we will approach the injection pipette where we have the sperm inside. And you will see we'll put the sperm very close to the edge of the pipette so that we only inject the sperm into the egg. And we will introduce the pipette into the egg all the way into the cytoplasm. And what we need to do is aspirate initially some of the cytoplasm to make sure that we've broken the membrane of the egg. So you can see the sperm going up first. And once we've broken the membrane, we will put the sperm right through into the egg. And even though that looks like a very brutal technique, it works really well. And in terms of the chances of the eggs to fertilize, they're very much the same with IVF and with ICSI all going well. So on average, we will get about 70% of the eggs that we collect fertilize with each technique. So whether we do IVF or we do ICSI, the chances of fertilization are very much the same. And then the chances of the embryos to develop normally are very much the same. And I want to introduce here the concept of time-lapse culture and also blastocyst culture, which is something that we offer here routinely to all patients, because these are 2 tools that allow us to choose the best embryos for transfer to patients. And it's something that we very much believe that we must offer to all patients at no extra costs so that we can maximize the chances of a successful cycle for everyone. So time-lapse incubation and photography is nothing more and nothing less than an incubator that has a microscope incorporated into it that takes photos of embryos every 15 minutes. And these photos allow us to generate the sort of videos that I'm showing you here. You can see here two eggs that don't look fertilized, but if you pay attention, you can see two round structures appearing in the middle of the egg. That's two nuclei that are called pronuclei. One is from the egg and one is from the sperm. So these two eggs are fertilized eggs, and this is what we can see the day after egg collection. After they're fertilized, they will start dividing, and these embryos are now 2 days post egg collection. At this stage, they should be between 2 and 4 cells. And if you look at those two embryos now approaching day 3, where they should be between 6 and 8 cells, they're very similar in that they have similar number of cells. The cells look nice and even, and they have very little fragmentation between the cells. So if we had to choose the embryos at this stage, we would have difficulty choosing which embryo will give patients the highest chance of pregnancy. So extending the culture from day 3 to day 5 allows us to select the embryos that will give the best chance of pregnancy, because not all of the embryos that we have will carry on developing at the same speed. Some of them will slow down or even stop growing, and that's within expectation. If you look at these two embryos still now on day 4, they look very similar. And so it's difficult for us to know which one has the highest potential. If we keep them for 5 days until the point where they're ready to get to the uterus and implant, we can see very striking difference in the last few hours of embryo development. If you look at the embryo on the right here, you can see it starting to expand and create what we call a blastocyst, much, much quicker than the one on the left. So on the right, we have a fully expanded blastocyst that shows already 2 cell types, which are very important for future embryo development. If you can see, there's a clump of cells at about 1 o'clock. This is what we call the inner cell mass, and it will become the fetus if the embryo implants. We look at it very carefully in the lab, and if it's a good quality group of cells, that means the embryo has a good chance of implanting and giving a viable pregnancy. But there's also a very important group of cells around the cavity of the embryo. If you see around all of the embryo, you can see cells. And those cells we call the trophectoderm, and will become what we call the placenta if the embryo implants. And again, we will grade them carefully because they are very key for creating a viable pregnancy. And as you can see, the embryo on the left still not showing us any of those 2 cell types, and it's a bit more delayed in development. So if we had to choose one embryo, very clearly we would choose the one on the right for transfer. And sorry, I want to move to the next slide. In this slide, you can see a graph that illustrates what I've just said, in that what happens when we collect eggs and we create embryos is that we will lose some at this stage. For example, as I said before, 80% of the eggs that we collect are mature, and of those, 70% will fertilize. And of the ones that fertilize, if you look at the very right-hand side of this graph, we'll have 60% that reach the blastocyst stage. And of those that reach the blastocyst stage, only about half of them are what we call good or average quality embryos that we can use for transfer and for freezing. So that's why we're aiming to collect a good number of eggs, so that we can end up with a good number of good or average quality embryos that we can have a good transfer, a good embryo for transfer, and hopefully some embryos left for freezing afterwards. So I'm going to explain what happens on the embryo transfer day, and then stop for questions in case anyone has any questions. So once we get to the blastocyst stage, what we do is we do the embryo transfer. And instead of putting the embryo coming down from the fallopian tube, as it would happen naturally, we will go through the cervical canal into the uterine cavity. And we do that under ultrasound guidance. This is the picture you can see at the bottom, because that allows us to see the catheter, which is a very fine tube that you can see in this slide, which is where we will load the embryo. We can see the catheter under ultrasound guidance, and we can see exactly where we're placing the embryo or embryos at the point of embryo transfer, because we can see the air bubbles that surround the embryo that is in culture media at the point of transfer. And we will ask patients to have a full bladder, which is slightly uncomfortable, but hopefully not too uncomfortable. And there are two reasons for that. One is it helps us see the uterus. As you can see, the full bladder is on top of the uterus, and it helps us locate the uterus under the ultrasound scanning. But also what it does is, because it sits on top of the uterus, it flattens the uterus, and it facilitates the entrance of the catheter at the point of embryo transfer. So I know some patients find it slightly uncomfortable. It's something that we do to facilitate the transfer, and hopefully it's not too uncomfortable. People in general tolerate it quite well. If it's uncomfortable, we will ask patients to empty their bladder, and we will wait for them to fill it again, perhaps not to the same stage. And I'm going to pause here in case there are any questions now.
Hi, Marta. Yes, we have a question from one of our attendees who asked, is IVF the proper treatment for couple experiencing miscarriages?
That's a very interesting question. Thanks for asking that question. We do IVF for people who experience miscarriage. I think what we would encourage people who have 3 or more miscarriages is to have investigations for what's called recurrent miscarriage, because for some of those patients, there are reasons why they are miscarrying. And if those reasons are found, then they might be able to address that before embarking on trying again naturally or doing IVF. Unfortunately, for some of these patients, we never find out why they keep miscarrying. And we do attempt IVF simply for the reason that IVF allows us to create more embryos and to choose embryos that have highest chances of being viable. Often miscarriages happen because embryos implant and they're not able to carry a pregnancy to term. So by doing IVF, we can potentially select embryos that are more likely to go to term with the pregnancy. But it is no guarantee of success. And, sometimes we do get miscarriages with IVF, just as it happens when people conceive naturally. But by intervening with people who tend to miscarry, we try and choose embryos that have a lower chance of miscarrying. I hope that answers the question, but if not, please just get back to us one way or another. Any other questions?
That was it. Thanks, Marta. No, that's it for now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll just carry on then. I just wanted to cover embryo freezing, which is something that we now do very successfully with a technique called embryo vitrification. And this is a technique that has been perfectioned in the last sort of 10 years, but particularly in the last 5 years, we've become very successful in vitrifying blastocysts, so much so that we now have evidence that the chances of pregnancy with a blastocyst that has been vitrified and thawed are very much the same as the chances of pregnancy with a fresh blastocyst. And the advantage of freezing those embryos is that they're essentially frozen in time. So if a person has treatment at 32 years old and we keep the embryos for about 10 years, when they come back at 42, they will have the chance of pregnancy of a 32-year-old. And so it's very good if we have spare embryos after we've done the embryo transfer, that we can freeze them, because people can use them whether they're successful with the fresh transfer to then create a second pregnancy for a sibling. But if they're not successful, they can come back and use those embryos with what's called a frozen embryo cycle, which is much less invasive and really as successful as a fresh embryo cycle of either IVF or ICSI. So we try and freeze as many embryos as possible if they're good or average quality. We will not be able to freeze embryos that do not reach the blastocyst stage or that are not good quality enough to be frozen. And the reason for that is that we have plenty of evidence that those embryos will not survive the freezing and thawing process. So we will freeze embryos that have a chance of surviving and implanting after that. And this is something that we will explain in detail when patients come through for treatment, also because patients need to consent for the freezing and storage of embryos. And it's key for people to think about how long they want to store those embryos, but also what would happen if things were to happen to either themselves or their partner if they have one. So there are lots of options in terms of storage of embryos and difficult decisions to be made, and those decisions we will help patients to make. But also it's important for patients to know that those consent forms can be signed before treatment, but they can also be changed at any stage. So people can change their mind in terms of how long to store embryos, what to do in terms of if they become mentally incapacitated. Those sort of tricky questions can be changed at any point before the treatment, and any new consent form will supersede previous consent forms. So I just wanted to touch quickly on the tests that are necessary before we start IVF or ICSI. And I wanted to put this slide on because I know there are lots of tests being offered to patients aiming to sort of diagnose or sort of improve the type of treatment or change the type of treatment that is offered to patients. And the reality is that majority, if not all of those tests that are being offered, really don't provide us with an answer as to why people are not getting pregnant. And there's no evidence at this stage that they will allow us to change the course of treatment in a way that will increase the chances of pregnancy. So the essential tests that we need to do is check the ovarian reserve of the woman that is going to be stimulated. And we do that by checking the levels of anti-Mullerian hormone and also by doing an antral follicle count. And this is counting the follicles that are in the ovary when the patient has just had their period. And that allows us to tailor the dose of the stimulation drugs that we give for the patients to produce multiple follicles in a way that we optimize the follicles that will grow and the eggs that we will collect by keeping the patients safe. We also need to do a sperm analysis if we are talking about a heterosexual couple, and that is simply to decide if there is sperm in the sample. So, if we can use it for either IVF or ICSI, and what sort of sperm quality we have so that we can decide the course of treatment. And then we also need to do screening tests, and most of those screening tests are to do with infectious diseases, and these are required by law. The Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority regulates all of what we do, and it is a requirement that we test everyone for those diseases, and this is to minimize the risk of any transmission of diseases either to the person that will carry the pregnancy, but also even to the embryo and to the fetus, and to make sure that we maximize the chances of ending up with a healthy pregnancy, which is essentially what we all want for everyone that approaches us for treatment. And I wanted to put this slide on because there's a lot of myth around sperm analysis and how to interpret them. And this is a slide that shows the sperm concentration for the same man over a period of 10 months. And you will see that the sperm concentration varies from nearly 200 million per ml to down to very close to 0 million per ml. So when we do a sperm analysis, it's really just a snapshot of what the potential is in terms of that man producing sperm. And often if it's below the normal range, we will ask for it to be repeated because, as you can see in this slide, it could be within the normal parameters later on. And we don't really use it as a diagnostic tool unless there is no sperm in the sample. And if we cannot see sperm in the sample, we'll again ask for repetition of the sample so that we can confirm that result. That is, of course, devastating news, and it happens very rarely. But if that does happen, then we will support the patients in understanding the possible reasons and making sure that they can make decisions moving forward in terms of alternative treatments. But what also I wanted to say is that what we will do is make the final decision on the day of a collection in terms of whether we do IVF or ICSI. And because we don't have an extra cost for ICSI, that really removes any financial pressure from patients to decide on the day of a collection if we find that the sperm for some reason is unexpectedly below the normal range. We might suggest that we do ICSI, and as I've showed you before, ICSI is very much a routine technique and it will give patients the same chances of pregnancy as IVF. And I just quickly wanted to mention other treatment types that we offer. I've already explained about frozen embryo transfer. This is something that we do routinely and is, as I said, very successful. Intrauterine insemination with either partner sperm or donor sperm. Ovulation induction is something that we will do for women that don't ovulate normally. By providing them with some medication, we might be able to regulate their cycles and they might be able to get pregnant naturally if they have a male partner that has normal sperm. And surrogacy is a treatment that is offered for people who are not able to carry a pregnancy, and that will include gay men or single men that need a woman to carry a pregnancy for them. And of course, we're doing more and more fertility preservation, and that includes egg vitrification for either patients that want to postpone and the time when they want to start trying to create a family. But also we do it for patients who are going to have any sort of treatment that might stop them producing eggs, and that includes cancer patients or patients who are transitioning. And we will do that also for sperm freezing so that these patients have the option to attempt to create a family later on when they're ready to do so. And I wanted to put this slide just to show again that we are very much there for patients, that we try and have different lines of communication. We are at the end of the phone and via email, but we also have a very safe patient portal through our patient database. And we will communicate regularly with patients about anything to do before they start treatment, to do with their consents, with their drugs, with their stimulation. So we will remind patients about the injections, about when their next appointment is, and we will answer any queries in that way. We also use a software which is called Fertility Consent, and that's not just a software for consenting. It's a software that is full of information in terms of videos and patient information leaflets, and that allows patients to look at those resources at their own leisure and be able to understand all what it means to go through fertility treatment and be able to answer any questions they might have. It also allows patients to fill in consent forms at home, and we will go through those consent forms when patients come through to what we call the scheduling appointment, which is when we check that the information is being understood, that patients are happy with the consenting process, and that they understand the drugs that they need to give themselves and the process of stimulation and treatment as a whole. So as I say, we provide information and answer questions at any point, and we offer a free counseling session to all patients that embark on treatment with us. And counseling is available to all patients throughout treatment. And it's something that is helpful to everyone at any stage of treatment. We have 2 counselors available to our patients, and they can take that offer either individually or as a couple if they are in a couple. And I also wanted to mention that counseling, what we call implications counseling, is something that we offer as part of the normal course of treatment for any patients that are having treatment with donated eggs or donated sperm. And this is something that supports patients to understand not only the feelings and the process of treatment, but also the legal implications of having treatment with donated gametes at this stage. So I just wanted to finish by thanking everyone and by just flicking to photos of our team at Bridge Clinic London so that people know who we are. We're very much a multidisciplinary team that reflects the multicultural background that is London. We all work together sort of very cohesively to make sure that we give everyone the best chances of pregnancy. And I will stop here. I'm happy to take any questions now and later on, as I said before. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. Thank you for a very informative presentation. We do have a couple of questions. The first one is there an age limit for doing IVF in our clinic? I think this is someone in their late 40s who went abroad for a couple of times before the pandemic, but wants options closer to home in London.
Yes, so in our service, what we do is for women that are up to 45 years old, we will assess their ovarian reserve and advise accordingly. We'll tell them, based on the ovarian reserve, what their chances are of conceiving with their own eggs. Over their 46th birthday, we will definitely advise to proceed with egg donation, simply because the chances of conceiving with someone's own eggs over the age of 45 are really very close to zero. And we want to make sure that people get a reasonable chance of pregnancy. We have very sort of clear data that shows that up to 45, and that's data that is in the HFEA website, up to 45. I think it's between, I can't remember, I think it's between 42 and 45, the chances are below 5%, but after that are very much close to zero. So we do not advise to proceed with your own eggs if you're over that age. But egg donation is a sort of treatment that can give you a very good chance of treatment at that stage.
Okay, thank you. A couple more questions. The first one, which treatment would you recommend for a single woman with endometriosis considering solo treatment?
So solo treatment obviously will involve sperm donation. And if we start with the sperm, I didn't go into detail with the options there, but people might be aware that there are donor sperm banks that provide, that sell essentially what's called unknown sperm donors. And these sperm donors really donate altruistically for the treatment of others. They're not known to the recipient or to the child, and the law now stipulates that any child conceived with those donations can access the donor at the age of 18, but also patients can come to us with a known donor that can be a friend or a family member, and we will freeze the sperm and process the sperm and consult the donor and do all of the processes that we need to do for that. In terms of women with endometriosis, what we would have to do is see the investigations that have been done in terms of the endometriosis and where it is and how bad it is in terms of whether it affects the fallopian tubes, whether potentially is preventing fertilization from happening naturally. If there is evidence that it might be affecting the fallopian tubes, then we would recommend to go straight into IVF. If we think the fallopian tubes are intact, we might recommend to do intrauterine insemination to start with, but that would be after checking all of the tests that have been done with regards to the endometriosis, depending on the age of the patient, and also the ovarian reserve tests that I mentioned before.
Thank you. And then the final question we have is, can you recommend any good resources for patients who are about to go into IVF with regards to the protocols, the drugs, the timing of scans, etc.? Obviously, this attendee is due to start the treatment soon, and she feels like she's not prepared for what is coming.
I'm sorry to hear that. I think if you're embarking in treatment with the clinic, and you're not clear about the stimulation protocols and the information, I would advise for you to go back to them and ask them plenty of questions. It is your right to get the answers. We are here to provide you with those answers and to make sure that patients understand what they're embarking on. In terms of getting information outside of the clinic that is providing you with treatment, I would recommend to look at the HFEA website, which has very, very good patient information, and it's information that is evidence-based. And also I would recommend to look at the website of Fertility Network UK, which also has a lot of information and support resources for patients. And of course, if you want to reach out to us and discuss your own sort of particular circumstances, we'd be happy to help you understand. But as a first course of action, I would go back to the clinic that is providing you with treatment and ask as many questions as you feel you need to ask.
Great. Okay, well, thank you very much. I think we're out of time. So from me, I think a big thank you for to you all for your attendance. And thank you, Marta, for your presentation. I hope you all found it very informative. And as Marta mentioned, if you've got any further questions or require any additional information, then please don't hesitate to contact us at Bridge Clinic. You can find all our contact information on our website, which is www.bridgeclinic.london. And again, thank you for your time tonight, and I wish you all a pleasant rest of the evening. Thank you very much. Bye now.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.